Shalom and welcome to Alma Center. We're happy to be with you again. I'm Avraham Levine, and with me is our founder and CEO, Sarit Zahavi, and Ibrahim Abu Ahmad. And what we're going to do today is talk about the Israel-United Emirates agreement. It's been a month since the beginning, the news that came out. And this week is the official signing in D.C. And we'd like to talk about a few angles that we think should be out there and are not spoken about enough. And I'd like to start with you, Ibrahim, and ask, what's the big deal? I mean, we've even seen people talk about President Trump getting a Nobel Prize for this peace agreement. Now, it's not the first peace agreement. It's not the second. Egypt, it's been 40 years we're in peace with Egypt. Great relationship today. It's been over 25 years since the peace with Jordan. And we had a long history with these states. These are states that we were in not one and not two wars. United Emirates? What's the big deal?
First of all, welcome to everyone. And yeah, it is a historic week. The signature of the peace agreement is something that is definitely significant. And particularly because of the fact that we're talking about a peace agreement that is not just a technical peace agreement like we've seen with Egypt and Jordan. Yes, we've had wars with these two countries. Yes, we've been able to reach peace agreements with them, but these peace agreements have been left for the past 40 years on a very technical level. Today, if we go to Jordan and Amman, a lot of the Arab minority in Israel go to study there, particularly in higher education, but we don't see anything above that. We see a lot of Arab Israelis visiting these countries, but not as much Jewish Israelis. We don't see a relationship, a warm one, between both sides on the ground.
Between both people.
Between the people themselves, yeah. When we're talking about a grassroots level, the peace is not on those levels. I spent 1 year in Egypt and I lived in Cairo, and particularly for our Israeli audience, I would like to say that the Cairo and Egypt is not Taba and the Sinai, and these are two different populations. The warmth and what we see in Sinai, because these are people who rely on Israeli tourism, is not Egypt. It's not the Egyptian population. When I was in Egypt, I was actually astounded by the fact that the hatred towards Israel, just outright hatred, is even higher than the Palestinians who were with me in Egypt. It was mind-boggling. I couldn't believe the amount of just feelings about Israel and the anti-Israel feelings within the Egyptian population.
Did you study with Jordanian students too?
Jordanian students as well, and they had similar notions, and particularly when you take into account that half of the Jordanian population is a Palestinian one. So on the level, on the people level, even in Jordan, there isn't any warm or acceptance to Israel as a people. There is on the tactical and economic levels, security and gas agreements with Egypt and stuff like that, but not on people relations. I've met one Egyptian student actually who came to Israel, and he was the only Egyptian student to come in the past, I don't know how many years. And even when he came here, the Arab minority did not accept him in the university. He was not accepted by the Arab population in Israel. They considered him as a traitor. And vice versa, some people thought that about myself when I was in Egypt. Why are you here and how come you're part of this country? Egyptians did not know that there are Arabs in Israel, even though they're the state next to us. So that can tell you about the people relations between Israel and our neighbors.
So what do you think changed now in the Emirates that now you see, we were very warm welcome, pictures together, tweets all over the place with both flags together, young children, students celebrating this agreement for the last couple of weeks. What's the difference? What happened since then?
I think the difference is the fact that the agreement is signed now. If it was signed 40 years ago, it might have been different. But today, the Arab world is moving away from what we call pan-Arab nationalism, or in my eyes, it's like my parents' generation and the ideology that the Palestinian people had 40, 50 years ago was a very Nasserist one. It was on the rise of Nasser. And he's the one who introduced the ideology of pan-Arab nationalism and Nasserist ideology that relied on the ideology that the Arab is one nation. The Arab population is one nation. And the Palestinians clung onto that notion because it was easier to imagine a war with Israel where all the Arabs fight together. It was a very, theoretically a very entertaining idea for the Palestinians that if all the Arabs will come together, fight Israel, we'll win. And on the a very idealistic mindset, that was the notion.
As an Israeli growing up here, you grow up, who's your enemy? The Arab world. That's what we all thought. That's how we grew up. Maybe today that's not true anymore.
And the Arab world is literally moving away from that. And the Palestinians are staying behind, by the way. So the Arab world is going towards a nation state, which is something that was established 70 years ago, but it's taken time to accumulate and understand what it is a nation state. And that each country has its own interests, its own values, the things that they see and deem as most significant for their interests in the short and long run. And the Palestinians are still clinging on to the fact that no, the overall interest with the Palestinian case in the middle is what's the most significant for the Arab world.
But Ibrahim, 10 years ago, it was almost impossible to talk about nation states when we've seen the Arab Spring, and we actually have seen the collapse of this idea of nation states. And what we have seen going on in Syria and in Iraq was actually a conflict between Shiites and Sunnis. And everybody were talking about the creation of two camps, the Shiites and the Sunnis, that will replace the old artificial order of the nation states. And I think that what you are talking about is actually two contradicted trends that we see evolving following the development of the war in Syria. That one is, yes, stressing of nation states in a sense, but in other states, and you can see this clearly in Syria and Iraq, the division to two blocks, the one that goes with Iran and the other one that goes with Saudi Arabia. And that's why you see the Emirates that are part of the Saudi bloc and the Egyptians that are part of the Saudi blocs are going towards normalization with the Israelis, while the Iranians are those who are leading the camp that is denying the existence of the State of Israel.
So what's the great divide today in your eyes?
I think this is it. It's these two blocks. And by the way, when you are asking what's the big deal, I think security is the big deal. We do have excellent security cooperation with Jordan and with Egypt, but as you say, it didn't went further into the people. With the Emirates, maybe it's the opposite way. The fact that we're going to have normalization and that the people accept warmly the normalization with Israel actually will open the doors to further security cooperation with Israel. And I think this is something that both sides are interested in because it will enable the Israelis to have a closer front to the Iranians, like the Iranians developed a front over here in Syria. And now we can have a front with them in the Arab Gulf. For the Emirates, the benefit is that they can win not only the F-35, maybe other, technologies of defense that can defend them from the Iranians. And one more sentence is Bahrain.
Right.
We're barely finishing the UAE agreement.
That's the amazing news. Netanyahu is going to shake two hands when he's going to Washington now. And I think this is also part of that yes, it's...
But for our viewers, how is Bahrain different from the Emirates?
Well, half of the population in Bahrain are Shiites, while the kingdom, the leaders are Sunnis. And Iran and Hezbollah are very, very active to undermine the internal situation in Bahrain. And I think this is the main interest of Bahrain with normalization the relationship with Israel. There is a lot of room for cooperation against Hezbollah, for example, a lot of room for cooperation in internal security of the Bahrainis themselves. But I'm happy to see this process going on as an Israeli, but I'm also a little bit worried because, again, I'm afraid of what were the promises that were made from the Bahrainis, and Ibrahim, maybe I would love to hear your opinion. what which country is more stable, the Emirates or Bahrain?
I mean, if we're talking on the surface, everybody can see the stability of the UAE, particularly. Uh, there is a higher risk with Bahrain because of the Shiite population, because it's a Shiite majority, and yes, Hezbollah will always try to influence on the ground, change the perspective of people. It works in the most proficient way on civil level. Hezbollah is very expert at working on the civilian level and try to influence the minds of the people. And that will impose a threat to Israel, particularly when we're talking about people flying and visiting these two states. Absolutely, that's something that it's peace agreement and everything, but the threat will remain. And a threat for Israelis who will visit these countries will definitely remain so. There are Palestinians in these two countries. There are people with interest in these two countries, and we might see clashes involving Israelis in Bahrain and UAE in the future. That's something that obviously we want to avoid, but we have to always maintain that as a possibility.
Will these states be targeted now by Iran? They're much closer. They're an easier target. Are they now? Should they be taken into consideration that they might be targeted not only in the grassroots sense but also in the military sense, security?
I don't know what you think, but I believe that part of the reason that they are having normalization with Israel is the fact that they are already being targeted by Iran.
So this is
It's only an acceleration of a process that is already going on.
And but one thing for sure that they are going to be, even more so of a scope and focus on UAE and Bahrain. And we saw the attack against Saudi in the past, and we can expect maybe an attack on the infrastructure level by Iran. That always is a possibility.
So you brought up Saudi Arabia, it's the elephant in the room. Let's talk about them for a moment. Formally, they did agree that the Israeli airplane will fly above them, which was a great development. But they're not part of the agreement. They won't be part of the signing in DC. But I think they're still, right? How do you see, what's their part in this development?
They are the big elephant in the room, no doubt, meaning that they approved. The fact that we have normalization with the UAE and Bahrain will only open up more levels of connections between the Israelis and the Saudis. I don't know whether they will make it public. This is, I think, the biggest question. How long it would take until Saudi Arabia itself would make it public. I don't know. What do you think?
I think it's becoming a snowball. We had UAE, now Bahrain. I think it's just more of an opportunity for Saudi to come out with open relationships without any fear or excuses because, hey, everybody else did it, so why not us? So that could be something that could happen in the near future.
I think that the price should be probably would be very high. Either they would get something amazing from United States, or they would get some concessions from the Israelis within the Palestinian issue. I don't know. Something must happen for them to jump into the top.
Well, they're not necessarily next. There were talks of Sudan, so maybe the African front is next to join in.
Which is, by the way, even a less stable country than the other two, and that's why I'm even more worried.
In terms of what's their side, what's their
benefits from the Americans, and where this ammunition will end up eventually.
Well, that's left open to see. Do you have anything else to add about the ceremony, DC? We're all. This might be the last chance for us to meet together before the COVID-19 splits us apart. Everyone will work from home. So anything else you think?
I think one topic that it's important to mention is the criticism that we're hearing to our audience, particularly the ones who are seeing us from abroad. There's a lot of criticism on the peace agreement, focusing on the deal with the F-35. And this is something that we're seeing in the Israeli media, and focus on whether or not Israel gave concession to an arms agreement and the selling of F-35s to the UAE. And in my perspective, currently the Israeli media, because there is a lot of focus on Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu, there is a focus on him in the media in general. So when we're talking about something good that's going on in terms of Israel's interest, there's always going to be an attempt to try to find where is Bibi being not okay. I mean, we can have criticism against the Prime Minister, that's why we live in a democracy, but I think it's overly looking into anything that could be, you know, how can we show him in a bad way when there's not even necessary, because the US is a sovereign state, and it has the right to sell ammunition and arms to any country in the world it desires.
We're not in charge of the.
We're not in charge of the United States, and I think the Israeli media sometimes forgets it. We're not in charge of the United States. We're not responsible for what they do. They have their own interests, and they can sell arms to any state they want. And obviously, there is an interest between the U.S. and Israel to maintain Israeli superiority in terms of a military position, but I don't think that selling 10 F-35s will make the UAE army stronger than the IDF. I think it's absurd to assume that just because they're selling them F-35s, the whole army is going to be stronger than the Israeli army.
I tend to agree.
Very good. So I'd like to say that first of all, we congratulate all parties, Emirates, Bahrain, if this finalizes. Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump. We're very happy to hear about the development. Maybe not surprised literally, but generally speaking, it's a great development. We all agree about that. I'd like to take the opportunity to say Happy New Year. We're celebrating the New Year, the Hebrew New Year, this weekend. So Happy New Year to everyone. And we hope to see you again.
Shana Tova.
Shana Tova and Shalom.
Hopefully next year in Dubai.
Yes.
See you soon in Dubai.
See you in Dubai.
Shalom. Dubai.